Since people are still filing out, I think we'll give people a couple of minutes before we get started. But in advance of that, I'm just going to start introductions. So I am Jeff Holstrung. I'm the president of the Green Mountain Audubon Society. We are a chapter of the National Audubon Society that covers Grand Isle, Franklin, and Chittenden counties in Vermont. We've got about 1,000 members, and we historically have done programs in person. And for the past 5 months, we've switched to Zoom, and we've had good experiences. So we're going to continue that. I'm going to hand this off, hopefully, to my co-host Clem Nyland, who's the chair of our programs committee, to do the introductions. If that works for you, Clem.
Sure, great. We're extremely happy to have Matthew Young with us to talk to us about finches tonight. And Matthew does this work at a national scale. And I guess one of the silver linings of this COVID epidemic is the fact that we formerly would do just local talks. And tonight we're able to, reach out a little bit more and to luminaries such as Matt, who sees a much bigger picture in terms of tonight's topic of finches and how they move throughout, United States and Canada. And when we thought about this and talked to Matt initially, we asked him if he could talk about finches, but also to do a little focus on Vermont, because we're certainly seeing them this year. And so here we are. We're very happy to have with you all. And let's look at what our numbers are here. 45. So you're busting all of our records, Matthew. And let's hear what's going on with finches. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Clem. Thanks.
Actually, this is Jeff. One more time, if I can cut in, just so folks know what to expect. Matt, if you want to talk about how you're going to take questions, you can. All participants can put questions in the chat. We're going to break when Matt feels it's appropriate, and then Clem or I or Tom Gimacello will kind of mediate the questions and answers. So Matt, I don't know if it's 1 or 2 times you want to break during your presentation.
Yeah, I'll break it. I mean, I like to make these as interactive as possible, so I'll break 2 or 3 times, okay, just to give anybody. And if I can, I'll answer it at the moment, or I'll say I will talk about that soon, and I'll get to that answer, because I somewhat don't want to make it too choppy either. But it's nice to have some interaction. So. I guess I'm on now, though, right?
You're on. Go for it.
All right. Yeah. Thanks, Clem, for that introduction, and thanks Green Mountain Audubon for having me. It's a great pleasure to be able to do these. It's kind of nice for all of us. You could kind of do. It's almost like the, I guess it's the couch tour in a sense, because you can do this from your own home with a beverage in hand if you want. So. Anyway, so this is, I always try to give a little bit of a biography in the beginning. My love of finches started in the 90s. I was kind of late to birding. I did my undergraduate degree in meteorology and water resources from SUNY Oneonta, which is one of the state schools in upstate New York. And it wasn't until this picture here is actually me co-leading a Victor Emanuel Nature Tour Cornell Lab of Ornithology trip in the Olympic Peninsula. So really where my fascination with finches and birds, I was late to birding. I really didn't start birding until I was in my early 20s. And I took a kind of a continuing ed class, believe it or not, as a undergraduate student in meteorology and hydrogeology or water resources. And I took a job in Yellowstone. That is Upper Falls in Yellowstone National Park. I actually took a job as a host in the Lake Yellowstone Inn. I actually have I came from a family, my father owned a restaurant. And I'm kind of social compared to a lot of scientists. So I was actually on the upper rim of Yellowstone in the summer of '95. And I had just started birding basically in the last 6 to 12 months, but really at the novice level. and a flock of crossbills come flying in to some lodgepole pine, and I just looked up at these birds and I was just like, what the heck are they doing? I could see them manipulating the cones, and then that was a spark moment from there. And then anybody that kind of goes on to have a career in this, I think you have a couple different spark moments to kind of continue to perpetuate you forward into building kind of a career in this. So after this, I was there in the summer of '95. I then took a position in AmeriCorps. I don't know if hopefully everybody knows what AmeriCorps is, but if they don't, it's basically domestic-based Peace Corps. It was the first full year of AmeriCorps. It was the first full. It was a residential program I actually enrolled in, and that's really where my career shifted to birds. This is Mount Adams, and so we had it was a 12-month position there. I think it was 1,700 hours of service. AmeriCorps started out with a little less of used to be more environmental and educational. It's shifted more educational. And so it was in Mount Adams, at Mount Adams, where I really then became fascinated with finches. And I would do these snowshoe hikes or, into wilderness areas to do the check on carnivore camera sets in the wilderness at the base of Mount Adams to look for whether there was any evidence of pine martens or Canada lynx. And on those trips, when you're in these, mountainous kind of wilderness areas of the West, the bird diversity is fairly low. And so, these friends of mine, I got to the point where I would consider them friends of mine on these snowshoe hikes, and were always finches. I could always rely on finches. There were these flocks of pine siskins and evening grosbeaks and red crossbills on almost all of these snowshoe hikes. So that's really where my career really started to shift to birds. And there was a gentleman that his family had kind of settled this valley, and he led bird walks. And I would go on these walks, and I realized I had a bit of an audiographic memory at that point for birds. So I shifted to birds. And so just getting back to like the fascination with finches, particularly crossbills, is where I kind of, my main focus has been. I started out finches, but certainly in the last 10 years, I've done an awful lot of work on red crossbills with just identifying call types for the larger community out there, the birding and ornithological communities. But finches, particularly crossbills and pine grosbeaks, they act an awful lot like cold weather parrots. I mean, they look parrot-like. They use their feet and they use their bill to kind of carry food. They go to salt licks. They grit in the roads. They're social like parrots. So I'm going to play this and let everybody just watch, this feeding behavior that captivated me when I saw that flock fly in on the upper falls of Yellowstone.
Of the 10,000 bird species on Earth, only 5, all in the finch family, have crossed bills. The white-winged crossbill is found in the higher latitudes of North America, traveling from coast to coast in large flocks in search of white spruce trees. Females are greenish-yellow, males red, and both have 2 distinct white bars on the wings. Their unique crossed bill, with the lower mandible curving under the upper maxilla, is adapted to reach heavily protected seeds found under tough cone scales. To reach the seeds, a white-wing places the tip of the curved lower mandible against the cone while inserting the upper maxilla under the scale. Beak partially open, the bird uses the curved mandible as a lever, twisting his head as he pries up the scale. He eats the seed, discarding the husk. The curve of the mandible provides the leverage needed to force the scale up, enabling crossbills to feed on seeds that are not accessible to other species. A whitewing often twists the cone off and carries it to a perch where it holds the cone in one claw and rotates it like a corn cob. Lower mandibles cross either left or right, and each individual always holds the cone in the claw toward which their mandible curves.
Those are seeds dropping, by
This
the way.
ensures that the tip of the mandible is facing the cone, giving the bird the best leverage to quickly pluck the seeds. Whitewings are remarkably efficient at harvesting their food. An individual bird can eat up to 3,000 seeds per day.
Wow.
Crossbills are able to swiftly bypass a conifer's armor as a direct result of their specialized beaks, an excellent example of evolutionary adaptation.
So that wasn't seeds necessarily dropping, but those are the seed coats that are dropping in the background of that footage. So this was actually a flock that I found in central New York that was feeding on white spruce. It was right after I had kind of started my second stint at the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, which, I've been there. I was at Cornell for across 2 different stints across 15 years. I actually have exited, but I'm still collaborating with them on the Finch Research Network and also on several other different projects. But anyway, fascinating footage there. And so this kind of, I always like to start out a little video because it always draws people in a bit. So, a super flight of finches this year we've had, and some people have thrown around this word Finch Fest 2020, 2021. And, you can look at these eBird maps, and just see the breadth of the eruption that we've experienced this year. You can see pine siskins. Yup, they are out on Bermuda. This was actually only November's map. I haven't even necessarily updated it into this for December, but there's been flocks of upwards of 60 pine siskins in central Florida, which is pretty amazing if you think about it. Purple finch also into Florida. And some of these birds out here, these are actually, most of these records that have shown up have been the eastern subspecies of purple finch, not the western one, which is really not eruptive at all. Common red poles now into the Carolinas, North Carolina, there's a few records. Vermont in some ways has had an amazing fall. And in fact, I'll get to some other points relevant to Vermont to tie in the local aspect of this invasion. Here's hoary red poles. Again, it's early December. Pine grosbeaks have really come out of the Maritimes and just took a left-hand turn. I'm a little bit jealous of where you're at because pine grosbeaks are pretty common, I think, around you right now. Whereas in central New York, there's a kind of a trickle of them. I've had 4 encounters, actually. I had an actual encounter with Zach Coda. I don't know if Zach's on tonight. And then, of course, we have, red crossbills and white-winged crossbills. Not quite as much of a movement, but still there. And then evening grosbeak. Yeah, there was evening grosbeak in Florida in as early as October. And there are now records that have now into northern Alabama, and there's one in Arkansas. So it's a pretty amazing flight. With this word super flight, you throw it around. It's like, what is the definition of a super flight? Well, typically, it's only been used in years that all 8 eruptive eastern finches move into the southern part of their, kind of wintering range. So this year we've had all 8 of them pretty much move southward in numbers, some more than others. The last year, that was comparable to this was 2012, 2013. But this one's a little bit better than that one already, I'd say. And, you know, it's the next closest, but you have to go back to 97, 98. We had this, you know, really epic super flight of finches, which, you know, it's kind of nice. I think we all could use some new birds around to kind of help us through some kind of trying times with COVID right now. So, you know, Vermont, you know, you've had, you know, obviously early on you had purple finches moving through in numbers, and the pine siskin invasion was unbelievable to the point where they were migrating at night. And some people recently have started to ask, like, it seems like there's a little bit of lull in the finches now. And, you know, these eruptions are always dependent on time and space to some degree. And there's always a changing of the players. So you're never going to necessarily have an abundance of all the finches where you are. You know, so this fall invasion has really kind of spoiled us in a way because all of them have been present. So, you know, why such an eruption of finches this year? And so, you know, really what it is a combination of different variables that have come together to kind of create this mass exodus out of the boreal forest. And it's what ties it all together is, you know, we've had a couple generational cone crops on spruce in particular in the east and parts of Ontario and Quebec, Maine, New York, Vermont over the last 4 or 5 years. And so you have all the finch, you know, the kind of the cone seed eating finches like crossbills and siskins. You know, the reproductive success has been way up and the populations have kind of grown over the last few years. There was also a really great birch crop in the Western Boreal, which for those that might not know, you know, red poles follow birch cactus crops or alder cactus crops. So you have that going on in conjunction with this spruce budworm outbreak that has blown up across, you know, on Ontario and Quebec the last handful of years. And so evening grosbeaks, believe it or not, and purple finches, and to a lesser extent, pine siskins, and even crossbills will feed their young or feed on spruce budworm. I mean, people don't realize, you know, if you have an abundant, high protein, abundant food source that you can raise young really easily, they're going to use it. And so that's what we've seen with, particularly with evening grosbeak, purple finch, and even pine siskin, and the other finches to a degree. You have this increase in population levels. So you have increase in population levels because of these generational cone crops, because of this spruce budworm outbreak, and also because of natural cyclical cycles of these eruptive birds. And so, you know, and another silver lining with COVID is they actually, Quebec and parts of Quebec and Ontario, I believe, I know in Quebec, they weren't able to spray the forest for budworm. And so the budworm outbreak is going to continue to grow. And presumably, we're going to see probably some good years here of at least some of the finches. You know, the last 5, 6, 7 years have been kind of lean for these eruptions, where for a while we were in these every other year or every third year kind of cycle. And so just with that, I was just wondering, are there any questions at this point?
We don't have any in the chat. So if folks have questions and want to put something in the chat, feel free.
Yeah, I'll give it a second.
So Catherine asks, what defines a finch?
Oh man, everybody wants, you know, I was on with, you know, I've done a number of, you know, probably done a half a dozen speaking events or 7 or 8 speaking events in the last 3 weeks here. And so I was on with David Lindo, the urban birder in Spain a couple weeks ago. And the same question came up, what defines a finch? Well, you know, that answer used to be simple. And I'll explain why is once upon a time, we were largely following this morphological species concept. And, you know, birds were being kind of lumped, related to one another based on morphological traits. And so in its kind of simplistic terms, a finch is basically a bird with a conical bill that's specialized for cracking seed. But in recent years, with the phylogenetic species concept and more genetic studies being done, you know, that's kind of scrambled that initial easy to define what is a finch kind of thing. Because, you know, when you look at diversity, you can have kind of, you know, convergent and divergent evolution that can lead to species looking similar or dissimilar, even though they're genetically quite similar or they're related to one another. So, I mean, I always give this example. I mean, look what happened with falcons in recent years. They are now lumped with not raptors, but with parrots. So, you know, that's just kind of some of what I'm trying to speak to. So, you know, look at honey creepers. Honey creepers were, you know, there's been a couple amazing adaptive radiations or speciation events that have been kind of studied and written about. And two of the biggest ones are the Galapagos finches, which actually are not finches now. They are lumped in with tanagers, for those that might not know that. But you also have a group that's been really well studied, the honey creepers in Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands. So about 5 million years ago, it's thought that adaptive radiation of honey creepers in Hawaii came from a flock of rose finches from Eurasia that got blown off course, probably in a storm, landed on Hawaii, and then they adaptively radiated out to 55 different species, to the point that some of those species that, you know, some of the birds or, you know, individuals that became species over time, some of those birds actually evolved to have almost hummingbird looking bills, even though they're related to true finches, which are the fringillid finches. So sorry, I can't give you a really, really easy answer there. It's just more complex than that at this point. But, you know, in its beginning days, it was conical bill for cracking seeds, and that was thought to be a finch. And that was based on the morphological species concept. But now we know that sometimes pretty different looking birds could actually be quite closely related from a genetic perspective. So is there any other questions before I jump in?
An easy one first from Bruce McPherson. Did the winter finch forecast predict this super eruption?
No. So, all right. So this is a little bit, you know, I could give you a simple answer, but I love to talk finches. So I'm always going to give you a little bit of the backstory. So, you know, as people probably, or maybe they don't know, Ron Pittaway, who was the finch forecaster for decades, and I've been helping Ron with the crossbill piece of that. You know, and for those that might not know, in 1999, I did the first eruptive finch survey for the Cornell Lab of Ornithology for BirdSource, which is the program that predated eBird, believe it or not. The simple answer is no, we did not predict a super flight. To give you a little of the backstory, when you do these predictions, it's very hard to predict a super flight. You don't want to over predict and then have the birds underperform. So you always hedge your bets a little bit. But we did predict that it was going to be a good finch eruption year, though. Did we see it at this level? No, we did not. So that's the kind of somewhat short answer. Any other questions?
So Rita, and Rita, you might have to unmute if I'm not getting your question right, asks, what is a generational cone? I can't see the third word is in parentheses. So if
Probably cone crop. What is a generational cone crop? So cyclical wild food crops basically follow cyclical patterns, like anything does in nature to some degree. I mean, the most famous one in some ways that people probably relate to is, snowy owls and lemmings. That's a cyclical relationship. So when I talk about generational cone crop, it literally was, a masting crop. It was a cone crop on the scale that a great cone crop on the scale that we had not seen in a generation. So whatever you want to define that, generations, sometimes, the smaller ones can be 12, 15 years, the bigger ones, 20 to 25 years. So yeah, we had two really amazing spruce crops in the east, or in the eastern boreal into the northeast in 2000, and I think it was 16 and 17 or 16, and then no, it was 2017, and then again in 2019. So that's what I'm talking about when I refer to generational cone crops. I mean, the budworm is cyclical as well. So for those that might not know, evening grosbeaks weren't even necessarily documented in the East until the late 1800s. They kind of followed what they call this baited highway of box elder that was planted across the Canadian plains, and then they loved box elder seeds. And then these cyclical eruptions became more common with evening grosbeaks, and then they were in the 1940s. They experienced or came across one of the largest, well, at least first known documented budworm outbreaks that occurred from, I think the first big outbreak was from 40 to 55. And that's when a lot of the northeastern states, including Vermont, I bet you, had their first documented breeding event or breeding, confirmation of evening grosbeak in the state was probably in the 40s. If you dig that up and do some research, I bet you the first breeding record for the state was somewhere in the 30s or 40s. And then in 65 to 90, we had another huge spruce budworm outbreak. And that really then correlated to these really, really big invasions or eruptions of evening grosbeaks and lots of breeding. And some people argue, were they artificially inflated? Everything follows natural food crops to some degree. And then Canada started to treat the boreal forest for budworm because it kills the tree. So that's been part of the dynamic that's seen this depressing of evening grosbeak, which is a good tie-in to my next slide. And I only did this 2018, but it shows the pattern of evening grosbeak populations in the Northeast have crashed over the last 30 plus years. And a lot of it has to do with the last budworm outbreak ended in 1988. And then there was kind of this plan by Canada to treat the forest up there, which then depressed, the budworm, which then depressed population levels or numbers of some of these finches. And so what we're seeing now is a natural, explosion or whatever you want to call it of budworm. And then they could not treat this past year in parts of the boreal because of COVID. So there's a silver lining. As crappy as 2020 has been, there's a bit of a silver lining that a lot of people did not necessarily see coming. I'm going to continue on if that's all right, unless there's a.
I had one more question from Richard that's linked to this, asking
Sure.
that a friend noticed that the grass seed crop in Vermont was pretty thin because of the drought. Does drought affect the finches, or is it really the bud work driving the birds south?
Again, it's all about food. what really, it's a mainly twofold event with these eruptions. You have high reproductive success, which leads to high population levels in a number of years. And then that's followed by a crash in food availability. And then you have this mass exodus. So when you bring up, drought, masting cycles, when I talk about food crops, on whether it's tree seeds of box elder or maples or cherries, or seed and cone development and seed development in hemlocks, or pines or spruces, those are all they're all linked to climatic variables. And the two main drivers of masting cycles are precipitation and temperature. So I think that answers the question. Drought, tree species will respond to drought in a couple different ways. So this stuff gets a little complex. So with soft cone conifers, which are the really pliable cone conifers, hemlock, spruce, cedar, those cone crops form or start developing in May, June, July. And they often are correlated with a wet spring or a wet spring, early summer. So if those cone crops are good, you're going to have high reproductive success. But the natural cycle of any tree, to some degree, is whenever you have a boom in a crop, whether it's seeds or cones or what have you, it's often followed then by a downturn in that crop, because it takes energy for trees to produce seed. So I hope that kind of answers the question. That certainly drought and precipitation and all that plays into it, but it can kind of play into it in different ways. And climatic cycles are often measured on more than just a single year. They're measured over several years. And so these eruptives are tied to these masting crops, which are then therefore driven partly by these climatic variables like precipitation and temperature.
Great. Thanks, Matt.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Anything else?
Nope, I think we're ready for the next part of your program.
All right. So, when you start to get to, obviously I evening grosbeak, it was a species that's now has been listed in Canada as a species of special concern. It is listed in Birds of the World as vulnerable. And so, now I'm going to kind of jump to some vocalizations that I've really kind of dove into the last, 10 years or 15 years or so. So, crossbills were, and evening grosbeaks to a lesser degree, there's call types involved. And, people are like, what are a call type? And so they are, they're kind of a fuzzy, recognized taxonomic unit of sorts. And the idea behind call types is, with these call types, there's an implied ecological specialization, particularly that we know of in crossbills. Now, I'm not a fan of, this is getting a little bit more in the weeds, but I'm not a fan of necessarily these crossbills having these common names of Western hemlock crossbill or Sitka spruce crossbill, so on and so forth. But with the call types comes an implied ecological specialization, and it benefits a call type to mate with its own call type because of these ecological specializations. I mean, that's what this whole adaptive radiation or adaptive landscape, what I was talking about with like Galapagos finches, with Galapagos finches, you kind of have these large, billed seed eaters and small billed seed eaters. And so they are specialized for feeding on different types of seed. Well, there's a similar thing going on with crossbills in that there's slightly different bill sizes, and they have slightly different core zones of occurrence of where they originate from or found from year to year. And then, they move around the country following these different cone crops. And, if you're a large-billed crossbill, like a type 2, it benefits you to flock with other large-billed crossbill type 2s, because those birds are going to be more efficient at feeding on like red pine and, conifers that have, seeds that are or have cones that have more defenses, and it's harder for the crossbill to get at the seed. Same thing with small billed crossbills. So, I just want to kind of play, some sounds here, learning the sounds and how to read a spectrograph. I'm going to play crested or pendula at normal speed. And this is a spectrogram, or spectrograph, I should say. And so, what I'm doing there, at normal speed, it's harder to process. Human brains have a hard time processing sound at normal speed. So I'm going to slow it down. And, and you can, when you slow it down, you can actually see and hear at the same time. Our brains can process the descending quality of the sound. Here's it at half speed. You can kind of follow the actual, the spectrogram on how it descends down. It almost sounds like a comb being your finger across a comb. So, when I say spectrograms, here are the evening grosbeak spec, the specs for the 5 types in North America. I have 6 spectrograms there because I'm not sure if there's a 6th type or not in the type 3 group. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on grosbeaks just because in the East, we only get type 3. It's a much easier system or less complex system than crossbills. They don't move around as much. Type 3 seems to be this boreal bird that comes into the East or Northeast. And then, in these big invasion years, you can find them all the way down the Appalachians. But I am going to play them quickly. You can see how they look differently, from one another. And here's kind of the range. The type 3 goes all the way across. Type 1 is actually found throughout the West. It is the eruptive evening grosbeak found in the West. Type 2 is fairly resident. Type 4 is resident to the, fairly, doesn't really move much out of the Rockies. And I hope to, one of the things we really hope to with the Finch Research Network is to dive into whether or not are there cryptic species that should be recognized in these particular groups, and should they be then therefore managed for? And are we possibly losing some of them before we even know it? So, here's type 1. The most different of all of them. Almost doesn't even sound like a grosbeak to me, evening grosbeak. Very, very kind of pure tone whistle. Here's type 2. That's a trill call, that second one, right there. All right, so this first is a trill. This is actually the flight call right here. So it kind of has, a buzzier sound to it. And then our type 3 is not that dissimilar, but it's when you look at a spectrogram of it, there's a little more of a burry quality to ours. And he's been tested. These are fairly stable. They've been tested over decades. I've analyzed over 1,000 evening grosbeak recordings. I'm somewhere approaching 11,000 red crossbill recordings. I know that's far too much for any healthy human being. So here's type 4. Kind of shorter in duration. It's a quick burst. Type 5's in Mexico, and there's only been a couple recordings of that. It's like Arizona, southern Arizona to Mexico. So there we have red crossbill, on a, hard pine. And there are the 10 types. And I've lumped these not 1 through 10 necessarily, but as in similarities to the look of the spectrograms. I don't want everybody to read these, but, and here is some of the, the phylogenetic tree. So you got the most closely related relative to the crossbills in general is the common redpoll, believe it or not. And, here's this interesting type 9 bird right here, which has been recently elevated. For those that might not know, it's a fascinating story. And this is why we're trying to, study this more, and why I really am hoping to, fund actual North American wide assortative mating study for crossbills and evening grosbeaks. And when I say assortative mating, I'm talking about, are these birds under differing environmental conditions mating with the call type that is like their own? And so getting to this particular bird, type 9, it was in the late 90s that a researcher, Dr. Craig Bankman at the University of Wyoming, started to ask himself this question of, is there a mountain range east of the Rockies that has lodgepole pine, but an absence of tree squirrels? Tree squirrels drive cone evolution. If you take tree squirrels out of the equation, crossbills drive cone evolution. So he was actually able to, over time, do a mark recapture study in the South Hills of Wyoming or Idaho, in one county, Cassia County, Idaho. He was able to do this mark recapture study where types 2s and 5s regularly come into this area. And he found that they were assortatively mating at 99%. And he was able to measure the cone morphology to the point where in the Rocky Mountains, the lodgepole pine was putting energy into thickening of the distal stalk of the cone, which is where the squirrels bite that off and drop them to the ground. And it was thickening the distal stalk, whereas in the South Hills, the lodgepole pine was actually putting energy into the thickening of the cone scales, making it harder for the crossbills to try to get the seed. So he was, he proposed it as a full species, and it was raised to full species status only about 3 years ago. And it's called the Cassia crossbill. It's a resident crossbill, which is different than the other crossbills, which are nomadic. And it was found to be monophyletic, meaning that, it's actually genetically different than the other crossbill call types. Now, before I jump into this piece, are there any other questions? I know we're running a little longer because of questions, but that's okay. Are there any other questions?
Feel free to put any questions in the chat and we can moderate them, but I don't see any new ones right now.
Okay. All right, so these are range maps that I did for the Birds of the World species account that I co-wrote with Dr. Bankman. And this is what, people from around North America and around the world, quite frankly, send me recordings. I run these audio spectrographic analysis, and then I determine the call type. What this is a little bit complicated. So when Jeff Groff did his monograph on these call types in the 80s and 90s, he was driving around North America. He was recording birds. He was capturing birds. He was doing morphometrics on birds. And he was then basically described the first 8 call types. And I did these maps, you know, and in some ways this is one of my proudest contributions to science. You know, for people that are in the small niche of the, you know, what I call finchophiles, people need to think about finches, particularly crossbills, in terms of core zone of occurrence and kind of primary zones of eruption. So the idea is, you know, they have a home range, but they will then erupt to an eruptive zone to some degree based on, they'll settle in the primary zone of eruption based on similarities in morphology in the main foods that they eat in those eruption zones, matching the morphology or roughly matching the morphology of that core zone of occurrence. You know, the food that's found in that core zone of occurrence. It makes no sense for a bird to move to an area that they're not going to be able to necessarily efficiently forage and survive. So that's what I've done with these particular maps here. And I'm going to play a type 4. It is rare in the East, but it's made news this year in that I think Vermont had its first 2 state records this year. There might be another record from 2018. If anybody knows that, put it in the chat. But there might have been the first state record of 2018. There's been a recent one in the last week, I think, in Vermont of type 4. And Jeff Groff, when he described these birds, he actually missed type 10 originally. But I'm going to play a type 4, which is a down up, probably the most distinctive of all of them. And then there's this type, let me see here, yeah. Then there's this type 10, which is just an up, you know, and that's really, you know, he actually missed this when he did his original monograph. He lumped type 10 in with type 4, which is somewhat understandable. But I'll play type 10. Pretty different sounding to my ears. Again, you know, I know I've listened to far too many crossbills for any healthy human being. One of my nicknames is the crossbill guy. You know, the Cornell lab actually ran a piece in Living Bird on some of this. And so we're not, you know, there's this Eastern type 10 now. We're looking at a possible another split in this group. There's this old Northeastern, Dickerman was a museum guy. He wrote some papers on what he described as the old Northeastern subspecies of red crossbill. And, you know, getting to the area of Vermont, this Eastern type 10 that I have been basically telling people to put into eBird as Eastern type 10. You know, Jeff Groff and I, the gentleman I was just talking about that did the original monograph, we've teamed up and we're actually working on a paper that is trying to look at the differences in this Eastern bird compared to this original type 10 that was described in the Sitka spruce forest along the Pacific Northwest. And there's some interesting, you know, data that, you know, this bird is clearly kind of different. And so, but it is the most common call type in Vermont from year to year. There's recordings that go back to the 1960s. I've been following this for 15 years. It was missed because the mindset is this old Northeastern subspecies of red crossbill probably went through a bottleneck when the forest was logged. The Northeastern forest was logged 100 years ago, and those population levels have now come back. So, and here's what it sounds like. And again, it's quite different to my ears than the Western type 10, or type 4 that these were all once upon a time lumped with. And I am not a splitter by nature at all. I am very cautious when it comes to splitting crossbill call types. The Europeans actually have split it out to 27 call types. And I actually think there's only about 15. So I'll play you this. It's a down up. Yeah, here's the same one. And at one point we thought maybe this was type 7, which is, I named it the enigmatic crossbill because nobody really knows what call, where that bird is most common. But I don't think it is type 7. I think we're probably looking at a different call type here. And so, when for Vermont, the most common one is this Eastern type 10. And followed by that next would be, in most years, would be this type 1 bird, which is the Appalachian Crossbill. Is most common in the southern Appalachians, but it spills over into the Northeast from time to time. It's somewhat similar to type 10, but I'll play the spec. You can see the map. Here's the core zone of occurrence. Here's this secondary zone. And then you kind of have these zones of eruption. These birds will follow and do pendulum swings from coast to coast sometimes. But so here's type 1. It's a hard descending choot, choot, choot. Again, it sounds pretty different to my ears, but I know that's relative. And then type 3. So in Vermont, where you are, you're located out of Montpelier, right? Is that right?
So closer to Lake Champlain, so near Burlington and
Okay,
up the
gotcha.
seas.
Yeah, gotcha. So that's an interesting area. So clearly the northeastern bird, is probably going to be 85% of the birds you're ever going to encounter. And then you're going to get maybe 10% that are type 1s. And then, the interesting thing is type 3 is the most nomadic or most eruptive in the Northeast. And you can see this secondary zone of a dotted line, secondary zone of occurrence, that when it comes into the Northeast, it comes in numbers every 2 or 3 to 5 years. And it'll literally become the most common crossbill in a year that it invades the area. So like in 2012, it was the most common bird. In 2017, it was about on par with the northeastern bird. It's a small-billed bird. And again, when I'm getting at, type 3, and, it's a western hemlock bird, it's most common or most abundant in the Pacific Northwest western hemlock forest. But where is a bird that is most specialized for feeding on western hemlock or Sitka spruce? Where's it going to erupt to? Well, it's going to go into the Northeast, where you can actually, where it'll be relatively successful because we have eastern hemlock here. And the morphologies of the cones are similar. And here is it's a zigzag up, down, or down, up, down. Can be kind of hard to tell apart, though, to some degree, even for my ears, to some degree. Yeah, here's another one. It's got kind of a squeaky quality to it, in my opinion. Smallest billed crossbill in North America is this one. Smaller billed than white-winged crossbill, even. And this one, I don't, Champlain Valley is interesting. Type 2 red crossbill is the most common bird in the Rockies, basically. We have low levels of them, low numbers of them in the East almost every year. And they specialize. They are the largest build of all of them that we find in the East. And so, you know, the Champlain Valley is one of the only areas that this bird seems to be somewhat regular in very small numbers from year to year. Other than that, you know, I could go a couple of years down here in central New York without ever coming across a type 2. In fact, I can go maybe even 3-4 years. But I know there's some areas to the north that I could find them, and it's often the Champlain Valley. So for Vermont, it's this northeastern type 10. It's then type 1. In eruptive years, type 3 can be the most common, but that is not common every single year. And then you get into this type 2 bird. Type 4 is rare. And so here's type 2. It's pretty similar to type 1. So the Finch Research Network. So, you know, this is, you know, this is collaborative with the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. One of the directors of the Bioacoustic Center for Conservation Bioacoustics is actually on my board of directors. This has been a project that's been kind of in the making for 5 to 10 years, to tell you the truth. You know, and I had some internal discussions about launching this, you know, actually under the lab's umbrella. And, you know, again, I have lots of input from the lab, but, you know, I basically decided that, you know, after several years of people that were traveling to gather data, and they were paying for travel out of their own pocket, you know, and there was some nudging of like, hey, you know, there's something here to this. And I actually wanted to go back and I actually work in my day job with emotionally disturbed kids at this point. I kind of wanted to go back and do that, but have the flexibility to launch this. So it's truly a network. We want hobbyists to citizen scientists to academics. You know, I have 3 different professors on the board of directors. It is a truly formed nonprofit. I am waiting on the 501c3 status. And when I say it is a network, I want everybody from, you know, the enthusiast, the hobbyist, to, like I said, to the academic. If you're wanting to record birds, which it's easy to do with phones now, by all means, record birds, upload them to eBird. You know, in fact, the Macaulay Library, where I was the collections management leader for better part of 12 years, is about to cross 10,000 red crossbill recordings. It is 45%, almost 45%, the most common species in the Macaulay Library collection than any other species. The next closest in number of recordings is Carolina wren at about 6,500 recordings. So, you know, and it's international. Like I said, we're trying to figure out, you know, the call type dynamic in Eurasia. There's a lot more, there's additional barriers trying to build this network across Eurasia, because you have so many countries with so many cultures, with so many languages, and they publish in different languages. But we're making some headway, you know, and here's the website, Finch Research. It's actually finchnetwork.org, but this is the cover page or the landing page. It is, you know, the Crossbill project is the flagship project. But we are actually, you know, and again, get involved. You know, anybody has expertise, anybody that has sound recordings, observations, you know, upload it. Donations we're looking for, because we're truly looking to fundraise and actually support student, you know, research projects, at least the field component of that. I don't know, people are on the, we have kind of a Finches mass crops, eruptions and mass crops Facebook page, and we have collaborated, and joined with, there's a group down in Pennsylvania right now that's studying the wintering range of evening grosbeaks in these eruption years. And they actually put out they teamed up with a design company to do a shirt for that. So, and we're actually part of that project and trying to fundraise for that project. So, we're looking at doing this assorted mating study in crossbills and in grosbeaks to see if, are there, cryptic species there, and we have an ARU unit. So the Cornell lab put up $16,000 worth of ARUs, which are autonomous recording units, for us to put out across North America to get preliminary or pilot data to look at densities and diversities of these call types and to hopefully do a long-term study. But we're also looking at getting transmitters, fundraising to put transmitters on birds as well, to look at these, the wintering range of grosbeaks, but also to look at survivability of finches. There's some concern that with global climate change and increasing winter rain events, that finches have a hard time. It's harder to thermoregulate in the wintertime if you're wet as opposed to snow events. And so that's another project we're looking at. Just today, I'm losing my voice because this is the fourth Zoom event I've had today. And I had a working group meeting with a rosy finch group this afternoon. And so we're looking to team and become maybe the host of a landing page for a rosy finch project. And rosy finches are interesting in that they are one of the, if not the highest altitudinal breeding bird in North America. There's 3 species. And there's some concern, like our northeastern Bicknell thrush, there's some concern that we're going to lose that, at least the 2 southern rosy finch species, the black rosy finch and the brown cap rosy finch, because of global climate change and birds literally marching them off the mountain, because as they move up the mountain, some of these species can breed at higher and higher and higher elevations, like we've seen with some of these, Bicknell thrush surveys. I think Vins, obviously, most people are probably pretty familiar with Vins in Vermont. So anyway, we're trying to provide a tremendous public service as well. The Finch Research Network, just in identification, we have absolutely been overwhelmed with an avalanche of recordings in the last month and a half, particularly of crossbills, and also photographs of red poles and these green morph pine siskins. We're trying to provide a public service to help people identify these birds as well. With that, again, we can be found at finchnetwork.org or on the Finch Masters on Facebook. And that last, that statement there, that paragraph kind of sums up, I don't know why it does that, but it kind of sums up my lifelong fascination with particularly crossbills. That's all I got.
Well, it sounds like that's all you got for a voice, Matt. I feel for you. I spent a lot of time online.
Yeah, no, that's all right. I can still take some questions if there's people out there still.
So we have 2 in the chat right now. First one from Jacob Crawford. Do you typically see a mixing of red crossbill types within flocks in areas where their ranges overlap?
All right, so, again, when we get at this assorted mating thing, I've put out 6, clustered in the Northeast, 6 in the Western Great Lakes. There's like 9, 10 clustered in British Columbia to Kodiak Island, and then there's a half a dozen in the Sky Islands of Arizona. And so, why I put them out in those areas is because those are areas that, after watching this landscape for the better part of 15, 20 years, 25 years even, is an area where you have a density or an overlap in a diversity of call types and a density of call types. And when they are breeding, so Tim Spar in Massachusetts and I, in 2017, I think it was 2017, spring of 2017, we drove all around the Northeast and actually recorded pairs. We got up to 117 pairs, and we only found 6 hybrid pairs, which is roughly about 95%, or what most people use as a cutoff for criteria for good biological species. Now, to get to your direct question is, there are occasions when there's mass cone crop failure that, like call type, even in these mass cone crop failures, they still want to largely just flock with their own call type. Because again, there's an ecological specialization. You want to be with others that are going to efficiently forage. But if you're a lone type 4 in the Northeast, and the only other birds around are type 10 red crossbills, it behooves you to flock with, the most closely related to you. So you do see, mixed flocks from time to time, particularly at communal sites, and particularly in these kind of, mass failure crops, or years of failure across several conifer species. But, it's amazing. This is, I never get sick of finches. And I was actually in a local spot about 20 minutes from here. I was actually there with Zach Coda. I imagine some of you know Zach. Just right around Thanksgiving, I think it was the day before Thanksgiving, he was down there. And we went to a local spot 20 minutes away. And we had this lone type 4 bird fly in. And I had not recorded type 4 all season from basically June up until now. And this bird flew in all by itself, gave flight calls, switched to excitement calls. It's given this excitement call for about 3-4 minutes. Then a flock of type 10s fly in, land in the same top of the, same tree. Type 4 and type 10 are calling back and forth, probably 5 minutes. And after 5 minutes, it was almost like, well, you're not my type. You're not my type. And the 10s flew off in one direction, and the lone type 4 flew off in its own direction. So it's, these birds know each other, and they're adaptive in that they're foraging on certain conifer species. And it's absolutely amazing to watch that play out live in the field. So they will form mixed flocks, but it's pretty uncommon unless it's unusual circumstances.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Next question. I believe that it is true that red crossbills can breed at any time of year. Have there ever been breeding records of red crossbills in their eruption ranges outside of their core zone of occurrence?
Yeah. So the deal is that, it's a bit of a unfortunate carryover in the literature that they could breed any time of the year. Now, there are rare circumstances they probably bred in like November, but they largely breed in two periods of the year. One is in July or late June into mid-September, and that is correlated with the ripening of the newly developed cone crops. And then they will nest again January through April into May, utilizing the last remaining cone crops. And so, when they erupt to areas, and if you go back to, let me just go back to a map here, because this kind of gets at the specific question. So type 3, moves to the Northeast in numbers. And type 10 and type 1 are the two types that I could find breeding in New York every year. And that's because they have a sense of familiarity because it's their core zone of occurrence. Now, type 3 regularly comes to the Northeast every few years. And in most years, they probably don't nest. But there are years, if the cone crop matches up, like it happened in 2017, 2018, when we found 4 different call types breeding in the Northeast, they will nest outside of their core zone of occurrence. And sometimes even in numbers, but they are at a disadvantage because they are growing up, in the Northeast year after year after year after year, like the type 10 does. But the morphology of the conifers are similar enough in this eruption zone that they will breed. And yeah, you can get type 2 breeding in non-native conifers out in cemeteries in the plains. But it's unusual, that's not the norm. But they clearly can nest, in eruptive areas, for sure.
Great, thanks. And then the last question we have in the chat is about evolution. So birds' beaks evolve quickly. Do flight calls evolve quickly too?
Well, we've seen, Jeff studied this graph in the 90s, and we see quite a bit of, the flight calls seem to be relatively stable. But to get at your question from more of a geologic time scale, which is what evolution kind of, works on, is the Cassia crossbill, which was type 9, is only thought to have evolved in like 6, 7, 8,000 years, which is a incredibly short period of time for a species to become a species. So the flight calls, there are, so the deal is with flight calls, they can form on a pretty small geologic time scale, but these call types, in these failure years, there's always a bit of a small part of the population that can break off because they got to move because the cone crop in the core zone of occurrence, it doesn't support the bird. So part of the population breaks off. And that's how you end up getting these kind of founder effects. You can have a crossbill that, a certain percentage of the population breaks off. They find greener pastures, and perhaps, they find an area that there's been a plantation of conifers that has different cone ripening phenologies. When I talk about cone ripening phenologies, I mean, like soft cone conifers, they develop in June, they ripen in August. With hard cone conifers, they form cones in June, but with like red pine or pitch pine or jack pine, those pine cones don't ripen until year 2. So for a crossbill, it's always about what is on the menu, and you need differing cone ripening phenologies to kind of cover that crossbill year or that cone cycle year. So there's always some food on the menu. So getting at your point again is, call types can evolve pretty quickly, and you can have these kind of founder effects where new call types can go off on their own trajectory. If they find greener pasture somewhere, they might stay there, and that call type might evolve over time into a whole new call type. It's kind of pretty much how, species form. Not that different.
Great, thank you.
Cool.
Another question. Can you determine what crossbill type by the specific species of tree where they are feeding? We have seen 4 locations, all red crossbills, all feeding on white pines in southeast New Hampshire.
No, it's, again, there's an adaptive landscape, and they've gotten these names, Western Hemlock Crossbill or Douglas Fir Crossbill, because Dr. Bankman kind of did this key conifer concept in that, they are dialed into one conifer. but it makes them sound like they're an obligate specialist. These birds are incredibly adaptive. It makes no sense in the Northeast for a crossbill call type to be a specialist, because we simply do not have, we have one of two things going for us with crossbills. We do not have a dense coniferous forest in the Northeast, but we do have a diversity of conifers that cover the cone ripening phenology of a crossbill year. So there's always something on the menu. So that's why we see relatively low densities of crossbills from year to year. But there's some out there, and they are conifer switching through the year. And all of the call types, to some degree, can feed on most of the conifers in the Northeast. So, you know, there's been this new alternate hypothesis that was just presented, and it's right in line with my range maps, in that there's this model that's been proposed, the Parapatric speciation model. It's been around forever. It's messy. And what it really is getting at, there's a twofold part of this, is that they have a core zone of occurrence. They are most adapted for feeding on a suite of conifers in that core zone of occurrence, and they conifer switch through the year to survive. And in some years, their alternate conifer can actually produce a much better cone crop than this kind of single key conifer. And, you know, crossbills are rich patch exploiters. So what happened was, over the last few years, we had this abundant spruce cone crop that led to great reproductive success. Now, in, I'm going to say, June, July, what we saw was this shifting of this reproductive success in this northeastern bird, shifted into this great white pine crop that we all saw across much of the southern part of New England into New York. It shifted into that white pine. And so we saw these crossbills feeding on white pine, not because they're necessarily specialized for feeding on white pine. It was because white pine produced a great cone crop that the birds could accept, you know, have accessibility to the seeds. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yeah, that's helpful. And that is all we had for questions.
All right. Sorry, I lost my voice a little at the end there, but
Okay, you've been a busy man.
I have.
Appreciate it.
You know, thanks again for having me.
And anyone, Clem, do you have anything to add from a program side? Anything coming up, or are we good?
I think we're good for now. The next one will be in January, but we very much appreciate, you know, you adding us into your schedule, and I'm totally impressed with the volume of the programs that you're doing. I mean, it's daunting what you're putting yourself through, but it speaks to the love that you have of the birds, and we've all learned a tremendous amount from you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean, this is a super flight year, and I could not, you know, it's in some ways it's serendipity that I launched this thing. We actually launched it the day of the, you know, the new Finch forecast that came out. And, you know, Tyler Orr became the new Finch forecaster after Ron Pittaway retired. And quite frankly, we actually have a page that dedicates the Finch Research Network, because really Ron in North America and Ian Newton in the UK started this network. You know, they popularized finches for a generation of people at this point. And so, yeah, it is daunting, but it's an exhilarating experience to launch this in a year that, you know, the birds are doing the work for me in a lot of ways. So by all means, you know, go to the website, you know, and you know, stay, you know, piped into our blog. We're releasing blogs every week. And, you know, if you can, if you have anything to spare, you know, donate to what we plan to do in the coming years.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, there's a bunch of thank yous, Matt, in the chat. And there's a thank you from Green Mountain Audubon Society for
Yeah.
your time. So
Yeah, thanks Clem for reaching out to me too, by the way, and Jeff for organizing this.